would inherit, if you own land, would inherit all of it, and all the rest of the kids would work for the oldest son. And if you didn't own the land to begin with, there's no chance. You're just a sharecropper at the time. So it was a locked-in caste system, essentially. And there's this persistent rumors that in California had land as far as the eye could see, and you could actually purchase land in a very similar climate of the Adriatic, of being a very mild climate. And so the combination of the push and the pull was a very powerful magnet for the Adriatic cultures to move and migrate to California. There's another interesting reason why you see pockets of Croatian communities rimming all around the United States, and that is that the Croatians were very good seamen. In fact, Marco Polo was born on the island of Corčula in the Adriatic, very much a Croatian, but he sailed out of Venice, so everyone thought he was an Italian. But because the Croatians were well-known seamen, the merchant ships that were moving to sailing to California needed to be manned by capable folks on board. And what the Croatian sailors didn't understand was that if the merchant didn't have a backhaul to sail back to Europe, they couldn't afford to sail back, so they just scuttled the ships at the various port of calls. There were so many ships that were scuttled in San Francisco that the financial district at one time was the harbor, and there's boats all underneath those high skyrises. So what happened from Miami to Houston to New Orleans, San Pedro, San Diego, San Francisco, Monterey, Seattle, all those cities have the very large Croatian communities. And it was because these sailors got stranded at those various ports of call. In fact, kind of a little trivia question for next year, the people aren't on this call, is the original name of Watsonville was New Dalmatia. And kind of an interesting tribute to the early community of Croatians there at the time. I forgot to start my timer. How long have I been? I'll figure it out. 15 minutes. In Santa Clara Valley, there was Italians and Germans and French, of course, were all there, and they were primarily vintners. And they all got together and they decided that Santa Clara Valley was the best valley to grow wine grapes. And so the whole valley at the turn of the century was wall-to-wall vineyards, not orchards. And one of in that process of developing their vineyards, they discovered that there was an indigenous grape in California that they'd never seen before, and they got all excited, and they made a bunch of cuttings, and they sent it all through Europe to their various home countries to test this new grape to see what kind of wine it would make. And what they didn't realize is that there was a little bug on those roots of this California grape. It's called phylloxera. And the California grape over centuries had developed a defense natural immunity towards this little bug, unlike the European grapes. And within 5 years, virtually all the grapes in Europe were died because of the phylloxera infestation that they imported through this California grape, as well as all the grapes in Santa Clara Valley. So Santa Clara then replanted into fruit trees. And by the time they figured out that phylloxera was the problem, and they figured out that you could graft European grapes onto this rootstock, that the trees were already planted and matured and starting to produce, and everyone had their life savings tied up in their fruit trees. So nobody wanted to go back and plant grapes in Santa Clara Valley. So they picked the next best valley, which is called Napa Valley. And that's the rest of the story, Paul Harvey would say, on why Napa became known as the premier grape growing area of the world. And Santa Clara Valley became known as the Valley of Forest Delight, the premier fruit growing area of the world. So it's really quite, very much of a fluke. And the native grape that made it all happen was the Concord grape that made horrible wine because it's way too sweet. But that's sort of the backstory of the early 1900s on why the two valleys developed the way they did. But you know, my grandfather, who had a limited education to third grade, could barely read and write, he had a PhD in wisdom, because I remember my father and he debating over to buy one orchard versus another, and my father was insistent that, you know, we ought to buy this ranch because it had much better soil and much more fertile. My grandfather said, no, we ought to buy this other ranch because it's at the crossroads of two streets. And he said in his heavy Croatian accent, he said, Santa Clara Valley is a great place to grow the apricots and a great place to grow the babies. And the babies are going to bend. And so he knew that someday this valley was going to be something more than an agricultural community. In 1885, my great-grandfather, John Spillage, escaped Croatia under the tyranny of the Austrian-Hungary Empire, and with the idea that he'd bring his family after he got settled here in California. And it took about 15 years for that to happen. And when they did, his whole family went. In the meanwhile, my grandfather, Paul Sr., was madly in love with John Spillage's daughter, 15-year-old daughter. And so he went on a year-long work strike, and the rest of his brothers said, go to California. And so it was really a love story, but there were provincial times of it in those days. And you could only court, the courtships had to be supervised. And so he had a job in San Francisco, and he rode his bike down to Cupertino on Sundays for a 1-hour supervised visit that didn't seem to impress the parents very much. So he figured that he had to do something other than being illiterate and with very little money. So he decided that every time he saved $1, he'd buy an acre in the Los Altos Cupertino area. And he was surrounded, Grandpa Spillage's properties. And about 10 years afterwards, he was completely surrounded with property owned by my grandfather. And so Grandpa Spillage was very, very impressed with that, gave a blessing for the marriage, and that's what the love story was all about. It was my grandmother was talked about attraction of opposites. Grandfather's third grade education. She was a brilliant, spoke 5 languages by the time she was 15 years old. And, but they were marriage made in heaven for sure. I'm checking my time out. Even though the reason why we settled in the Cupertino, Los Altos area, it always shocks me today because of the valley the way it is. But he picked it because it was in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't San Francisco, it wasn't San Jose. It was this white kind of hinterlands in the middle of nowhere, and the land was cheap. And he could literally buy land at $1 an acre at the time. And But he started his own orchards, but what really gave him his real start is that even though he could hardly read or write, he knew how to count, and he had this unusual talent of being able to drive through an orchard, and right at springtime when the blossoms are out, and he could tell 6 months later, within 50 to 60 pounds, how much fruit was going to come off that orchard. And he used that ability to buy fruit on the tree before the fruit was even mature, and from farmers, and because he knew exactly what was coming off that orchard, and the farmer didn't want to take the risk of if they had a large crop or a small crop, and they take the bird in hand from my grandfather. It wasn't until he was in his middle 80s that he told me the secret of how he did it, which is quite clever, that we'll talk about later, perhaps, if we have time. Just checking my time, I'm going to skip a few. The second big break, I think, came with my father, because we were in the fresh fruit business originally, and when you're in the fresh fruit business, shipping business, you end up with overripe that will never make it to market because it's too ripe, and so you dry them. And as our business grew, we ended up with more and more dried fruit, to the point where we had more dried fruit than the dried fruit packers, which led us into the dried fruit business. So my father, fresh out of college, learned while he was in college how to pack dried fruit at a higher moisture content without spoiling in the bag. And this was a big deal because at the time, all dried fruit was shipped at about a 9% moisture, and you couldn't eat it. You had to rehydrate it by boiling it in water. And it was an instant success. And all of our competitors were laughing at us because they thought our fruit was going to rot on the shelves, and they didn't. And my dad said the saddest day of his life is when he stopped laughing at him. Because basically, when you go from 9% moisture to 30% moisture, you're selling fruit, water at the price of fruit, an extra 21% in weight. The next item I think of note in our ag, and I'll move off the ag subject in a few minutes, is that it was the dried fruit industry was a very competitive business. In the 1950s, there was over 80 dried fruit packing plants in California. And by 1975, there was just a dozen left. And today there's only 4 commercial-sized dried fruit companies that process and pack approximately 95% of the fruit in the United States, and only 2 companies that distribute worldwide. And why did some of these companies succeed and why did some of them fail is the question. My father understood that the big problem with the dried fruit industry is that was your inventory hold. And you had to buy all the fruit when it was in season, obviously, you can't buy it the day after the season. So you had to buy enough dried fresh fruit and dry them to last throughout the entire year, based upon the demand from the supermarkets. And so you had to have enough fruit to carry into the new crop year to give time to process it and grade it and pack it and all that sort of thing. So the cost of hold, let's say if you talk about a $3 product, if it costs you 1% a month, that's over 30 cents a pound, just the cost of holding that inventory. And if you're dealing with hundreds of millions of pounds, that adds up very, very quickly. So my father reasoned that since the Southern Hemisphere was apricots from the peak of the season of apricots was Christmas Day, because they have alternating seasons, that all you needed was half as much inventory on hand to manage your business inventories. And by cutting your inventory costs by 50% was a major economic benefit for our family and for the business. And the interesting thing is that he's instituted the bi-hemisphere supply chain in the middle to the late 50s. And there's not one company that has ever copied us, which is to this day, I kind of shake my head and wonder why that no one has ever copied us. It's kind of a side story. I think I have time for this. We worked during the summertime. We never went on family vacations. That was our busy time. We worked 7 days a week. And so my parents would take each one of the kids on winter vacations that was combined with business travel. And it gave us an opportunity to see the world at a very young age. It happened that the trip to South America, to Brazil, Argentina, Mendoza, Santiago, Chile, I was on that particular trip. And in 1960, it was a pre-Allende days, and they were starting to nationalize all the land in the area. And so there was a big capital flight out of the country. And they passed the law to stop the outflow of money, that you had to actually live there. So, I'm listening to this conversation at a dinner, and I'm 12 years old, and I said, well, why don't I live here and become a resident, and so you can get your money back, Dad. And all the lawyers all stopped and said, well, actually, that would work. And then my mother, in horror, said, oh, we're not going to leave you behind in Chile. And I said, no, I think I'd enjoy doing that. And so, not knowing what I was even saying at the time, it seemed like a whirlwind where they were finding the Chilean family for me to stay, and got me enrolled in the local school, San Jorge Colegio, and all of a sudden off they went, and I'm this 12-year-old, and they're off on the airplane. And about a year and a half later, I was clearly homesick. It was time for me to go home, and an incredible experience there. But the day I was supposed to leave, there was a huge snowstorm in Santiago, very unusual. It was heavy, wet snow. And I boarded the plane. The plane rolled out onto the tarmac, got permission to take off, and all the lights went out. It was the whole region had a blackout that lasted 4 or 5 days. So the plane didn't take off. Taxied back to the terminal. And what I didn't know was that my father had arranged for our sales rep in New York to meet me in Miami, because I was just a 12-year-old, and to get me through in the international terminal and to the domestic terminal, all that business. And the plane never showed up. And Pan Am only knew that the plane had permission to take off, and they had no idea where it was. There was a complete blackout in Chile because of the power. And so they thought the plane was lost and went down in the ocean or whatever for 4 or 5 days. I finally boarded a plane. They didn't have enough fuel. They had to stop in Ecuador. So when I finally arrived in Miami, the plane was, quote, from Ecuador rather than from Chile. So they didn't bother to check to see me coming off the airplane. Finally, one of the airline reps went to our sales guy and says, I think there's a little boy that's coming out of the terminal. It might be the boy that you're looking for. So imagine the scene where I walk out and he just comes, running right to me. He falls on his knees and grabs me around the legs. And he started to cry. And I was stunned. I didn't know what this was all about. And a short time later, he called my parents, and I could hear my mother screaming with joy with the news. So it was quite an emotional time, and it was closed out a chapter of me being away for a year and a half at the time. Mm-hmm. Switching subjects a little bit, my father was a guy that obviously thought outside the box. I remember there's some pictures in the book of we're growing cherries in Sunnyvale, and if it rains when the cherries are at a certain stage, it absorbs too much water, and if the sun comes out right afterwards, it splits the cherries and it makes it completely unsaleable. And it's a common problem even today with the cherry growers. And my father saw the rain clouds coming over, and he knew that we were going to get rained on, and he ran over to Moffett Park and convinced an army general to fly helicopters over our orchards, or the cherry orchards, and let the crop wash shake up the tree and shake all the water off the cherries. It seemed like a decent plan, but it actually worked, and we ended up with the only cherries for sale out of California, and ended up being a huge success story. And as crazy as that sounds, it is today the common practice in the industry to take helicopters up and hover over their orchards if they get rained on. But he just figured that out on the seat of his pants. There's other thoughts and ideas that he had that weren't so good, didn't work out quite as well. He had contracted with Nestle's to dump coffee grounds on a piece of property we owned in Ripon, California. And it started to build up. He goes, well, I need to get rid of the coffee grounds now. So he tried to import giant earthworms out of Australia that were 6 feet long earthworms. And the darn earthworms kept dying. And at that point, a friend of mine that was reviewed my book, he gave me some suggestions. He goes, wait a minute, you cannot put the earthworm story in the book. It's just not believable of giant earthworms, Because you only can put it in there if you can find pictures. It took me about 2 weeks to find the pictures of the giant earthworms. And then he goes, and by the way, that three-legged horse that you write about in the book? And I go, yeah. And he goes, no one's ever going to believe you had a three-legged horse unless you have some pictures. And so it was actually out of the book until late in the game, I stumbled upon an old box that had pictures of Pal the babysitter that had 3 legs. And so the story of Pal and how he ended up with 3 legs is in the book as well, because I was able to find the pictures. Otherwise, he said, people just aren't going to believe that. Let's see how much time I have left. After high school, I decided that I wanted to be a priest and went into the seminary. And while I was there, I learned of an island in the South Pacific that had the highest concentration of leprosy in the world. And so off I went to work in the leper colony, and worked and arranged for a clinic to be built there, at all of the age of 19 years old. And I was just about finished with the clinic when we ran out of money. So I called my dad, and I know he was always a generous man. I said, I think I need $4,000 or $5,000 to finish the clinic. And he told me no. He just turned me down flat. And I was very angry with him. And so I finished up my work there and found my way home. And I did a very mature thing at the time. I gave him the silent treatment rather than talking it out. And about 3 weeks later, he called me up and he said, "Don't you want to know why I turned down your request?" And I says, "Now that I'd like to hear." And so I went to his home and he says, "You know, I kind of watched what you did with in the leper colony. And if you use the same ingenuity in business, you will find that it's easier to make money than it is to raise money, and you can finance 77 leper colonies." So that was a real turning point in my life, because I then focused and my attentions and efforts in the business world, and went to work for the family business. And a couple of years afterwards, I was in charge of my agricultural operations that now was in Australia and the US. And it was basically a perpetual harvest, where by the time I finished all the harvesting from June to September, October in California, I'd fly down to commute down to Australia for all the harvest down there. And I did that for a number of years. And one day my dad came to me and says, "You know, son, I think it's time to stop cultivating the soil and raising trees, and time to start cultivating clients and raising buildings. And so I want you to be the family developer." And I said, "Dad, I don't know anything about it. I'm in the farm side of the business. I don't know anything about building." And so he hired the president of the Coldwell Banker at the time to teach me. That was kind of his way of doing things. And anyway, one of the first buildings we built was for a startup company by the name of Apple. And that's when I first met Steve Jobs. And he was quite a character. I mean, he was so incredibly rude with all of his employees that I said, "This company will never go anywhere under this leadership." And then when I was writing the book about Steve, and I realized he was named the executive of the millennium, I go, what did I miss? But at the time, he came in and said, "You know, I'm short of money. I want you to give me 6 months free rent on this building they just built for him, and we'll give you Apple shares for 5 cents a share in exchange for the rent." And I, of course, turned him down flat because I didn't think he was going to be successful. And that one decision, if I had that stock today, it would have a B in front of the number. But anyway, I thought about Steve and I said, I'm a fairly good judge of character. Well, what was it that made him successful? And my conclusion was that he might have been a poor manager of people, but he was absolutely committed to a perfect product, and for a product that worked. And that's the reason why people bought Apple products, is that it was a very, very good merchandise. And I've never seen it written anywhere, but I'm convinced that he had a form of Asperger's because of his focused tenacity to perfection. But that's a story for another day. Another interesting guy was Wozniak. I was invited to go to the homebrew computer club by an old friend, Don Pizzolo. And I saw Wozniak type on his computer that it was like a little keyboard, and he was actually coding the Lisa computer program. And as anyone that knows anything about computer codes, you make one keystroke error and you've got a bug in your system, and it ruins your program. But he had the Lisa program in his head and recreated it on this little keyboard so he could demonstrate it to the homebrew computer club. And it was absolutely amazing. Then when he turned it off, because there was no memory, it was all lost. And I've never seen anything like that ever. Wozniak was absolute brilliant. And that was the first time I met Bill Gates. And he was a brash guy that was all about learning what everyone else is doing and wouldn't share anything that he was doing. But he blazed his own trail, and he did all right, I think. I got a little story about Dave Packard. I got a call from this guy. He just introduced himself as Dave, and he said, I bought an orchard in apricot orchard in Los Altos Hills, but it needs tractor work. And I said, well, we really don't do contract farming, but I have one of our growers here in Cupertino. He might do it. And so we went up there together, and he and Joe did the tractor work, and I sat down with Dave, and he explained to me a little bit of what was going on in the valley and the technology, why it was important, et cetera. That's how I met Dave. We became friends, and it was just really serendipitous at the time. In the mid 1980s, I bought the Ford Motor Assembly plant in Milpitas, and was all excited about it. But fortunately, my mother and my wife had a great way of keeping me grounded. I enthusiastically explained to my mom about the purchase. It's 3 million square feet, 150 acres in Silicon Valley. How do you go wrong? Blah, 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 blah. And she goes, I don't know whether to congratulate you or spank you. So that's another putting you in place in a hurry. And I came home, and I explained the whole thing to my wife, and she goes, that's great, honey. Can you take out the garbage? So I think what I learned from that is, you don't take too seriously your successes, and you don't take too seriously your failures. And we've all stubbed our toes in life, and if anyone tells you anything differently, they're not telling you the truth. And so it really helped me through the good times and the not so good times. As time went on, money became less and less important as I got older, and it actually meant very little to me. And I realized that relevance is what's important, and discovered it's the element of human contentment is relevance. And I was struck by a quiz that was given to me that I invite everybody that's in this Zoom meeting to kind of mentally think about when I ask these questions. Is name 5 of the wealthiest people in the world. Name the last 5 Heisman Trophy winners. Name the last 5 winners of Miss America pageant. Give me a half a dozen names of Pulitzer Prize winners or Nobel Prize winners. Give me a half a dozen people that won the Academy Awards for either as an actor or an actress, or who won the World Series in the last 5 years. Well, I don't know about you, but I didn't do very well on those questions in that quiz. I couldn't remember the headlines of yesterday. They weren't second-rate achievers either. They're the best in their field, but applause dies, and the awards tarnish, and the achievements are forgotten. Accolades are buried with their owners. And what really, the real realization of life to me then were the people that cared. And there was another series of questions that were asked. It was interesting. List a few teachers that aided you in your journey in school. I could name a number of them. Or 3 friends that helped you during a difficult time. Or 5 people who taught you something worthwhile or made you feel appreciated. Or a handful of people you really enjoy spending time with. Or heroes that have actually inspired you. Those are the people that make a difference in our lives, not the ones with the most credentials, the most money, or the most awards. They're the ones who care. And if you wanted to stay relevant, then care for other people. Thank you.
Thank you, David.